This video was digitized from the original DVD in 2023 by Simply Franciscan. It is part of the Zmuda-Moffat Collection of video recordings of lectures given by Franciscan professors and theologians on topics of Franciscan theology, charism, spirituality, and ministry. The lectures span more than 20 years. The Zmuda-Moffat Collection captures some of the seminal lectures shared with the Franciscan family in the rediscovery of the Franciscan intellectual tradition, a process which began in the 1970s and continues today. Sister Lisa Zmuda and Sister Kathleen Moffat videotaped these lectures from approximately 2001 through 2022 with permission from the speakers. Separately, they created and distributed study guides to accompany the recordings. Those study guides are available with the videos. Please look for a link in the YouTube post. For further information on the Zmuda-Moffat Collection, please visit our website at simplyfranciscan.org.
So the question is, and this is a great question to think about, right? What if the incarnation were always part of God's plan? What if everything, and I mean everything, that has been created and has been put in place was created in such a way that God could become part of it? Now you think about that. You think, has it ever bothered you that God never became an angel? I mean, the angels sinned, right? I mean, if we see the incarnation in relationship to sinfulness and the fall, well, Lucifer and his crowd, they fell before Adam and Eve. Don't they rate? Why did God? No, obviously no, they don't rate. Why did God choose to become one of us as a result of the fall and not give the angels a chance at that? Maybe stop and think about it. If God has become human, but God didn't become an angel, you know what that means, don't you? We're better than the angels. That's what it means. We're better than the angels. Because we are more loved in some way than the angels are. Now, you know, we can't grill God and ask God, why do you love us? You don't. What about Michael? What about Gabriel? Are they feeling bad? Are they jealous? Hopefully they're not. But this is the whole reflection around the incarnation. And what does it mean to say, God so loved the world, he became, or he sent his son? And we'll come back to that quote a little bit later on. Scotus says, and this is just so you can, I'll show you a couple of quotes of Scotus that are readable. Scotus says, you know, the incarnation is God's greatest work, God's summum opus. Like an artist. I mean, think of a Beethoven symphony, or think of a great symphony, or think about, for a composer or an artist, you know, tell us what's the greatest work of art you've done? And I think Scotus, in Scotus's mind, God would say, well, it was the incarnation, it was the greatest thing I ever did, was become human. Now, if we affirm that the incarnation is the greatest thing God has done by becoming human, then this causes Scotus to begin to think about, well, wait a minute. Would you want the greatest thing you'd ever done to be the result of somebody else's mistake? We should all shake our heads. No, we don't want that. You'd want the greatest thing you'd ever done to be something that you chose to do because it was a great thing to do. And that not just there wasn't any good reason not to do it, but there were just a host of wonderful good reasons why you'd want to do it. So to look at it in a linear way, for those of you who are more linear thinkers, it would look like this. What's God's desire, right? What is God's desire? God is a Trinity, right? So three people. those of us in religious life, and even those of us not in religious life, you know that where 2 or 3 are gathered together, there's a party, right? I mean, isn't that right? So there's you've got the Trinity, right? And what is the Trinity doing all during eternity? Probably planning a party, right? Getting the decorations out, sending the list, who's going to be invited, do we have enough food, do we have enough place? Think of all the parables that Jesus tells that are about the banquet. When Jesus is trying to talk to us about the nature of God's life, it's all about the abundant banquet to which everyone is invited. So God's desire is complete communion with all of reality, right? That God may be all in all. Go back to the Ephesians quote, bringing all things together in and through Christ Jesus. So that's the goal, is to invite everyone and everything, and we'll talk a little bit later about whether dogs go to heaven, but everyone and everything into divine Trinitarian life. That's the goal. So that's way at the end of the road. That's what we're aiming at, to bring everything and everyone together. So how are you going to do that? Well, my gosh, you're going to have to figure out a way of doing it. And in the case of God, obviously the way that the Trinity figured out to do it was to actually come and become part of the action here, to let people know how much they're loved, to let people know what a wonderful and gracious God we have. But you can't come into a situation that doesn't exist. You're going to have to create a world, right? So you're going to have to get trees. And somebody was also telling, I have all this, anecdotal information. Somebody was telling me that there are 15 different criteria for a planet that's inhabitable by life. I mean, and they have all of these things, and the scientists in the room would be able to give a small talk on that later on, maybe during the break. But the idea is that there are certain qualities that have to occur. One of them has to do with a moon. I'm not sure about that. Water, obviously, that's kind of the first thing. But there has to be a moon, and there has to be something like a relationship to a star like the sun. I mean, really, when you start and when you think about it, the job description for us was a job description for which there were probably only a couple of really good candidates, of which we were one. Now, is there another one someplace? Maybe. Maybe. Read C.S. Lewis, right? Perelandria, I think, is his novel where he talks about this other place where, God chose to become, maybe human, right? If they have humans there, God chose to become whatever they were. So you've got the creation piece, and so you've got all of those pieces that go into line. So if you notice, and I'm sure you're way ahead of me on this, notice what's happening for SCOTUS. He's lining it all up in a very linear way of planning. Beatitude is the end. That's the communion. That's heaven. That's the kingdom of God, however we want to describe it. That's the union of all with God in and through Christ Jesus. Now to get there, of course, you have to have Christ Jesus, right? So that's the incarnation. And in order to have a place for somebody to be born, you have to have a place, you have to have parents, you have to have, the whole, so you get creation. We can add in the covenant would be an intermediate step. You'd have Mary, right? The Annunciation, she had to say yes. I mean, oftentimes as I think about this, I think, well, is it possible that God asked a few other women first? Maybe God had been trying for a long time to become incarnate and nobody would take him up on it. I mean, you think about it, right? Hey, sweetie, right? No, thank you, right? But Mary said yes. We think as if, and of course, hindsight is 20/20. We think as if Mary was the only person ever asked, ever thought about, and Scotus thought that, and the Franciscan tradition thinks that. But I suppose when you think about it, maybe there were other cute girls around. Now, I love to show this slide both because I'm a sister of St. Joseph, and St. Francis de Sales has had a profound impact on our tradition, but also to show the influence of somebody like Scotus on somebody like St. Francis de Sales. Those of you that might be familiar with his writings, the Treatise on the Love of God, the Introduction to the Devout Life. Francis de Sales, in his own 17th century, wanted to extend spirituality, authentic spirituality, to as many people as possible and outside of religious orders. And so a lot of his writings and his pastoral work was to reintroduce ordinary people to the enormous love of God at a time in the history of French spirituality, where those of you who know your history know there's a lot of Jansenism. There was a lot of emphasis on sin, a very pessimistic way of thinking of, the 30 Years' War, a lot of pessimism around, there was religious conflict, all of that was going on at the time in France, and not too unlike some of the things we see in our own world today. But this is a great quote, and it's from his homily, for midnight mass in 1622, right, Christmas Eve. God's goal in creating the world was to prepare for the incarnation. That was the goal. The end of his plan was the beginning. And divine wisdom saw from all eternity that the Word would become flesh, taking on our nature and coming to live among us. And all of this was done before the creation of Lucifer, so even before the angels, and the world, and, importantly, we'll come back to this, before the fall of our first parents. Okay, so this is Francis de Sales, Doctor of the Church. As I gave this presentation one time several years ago, it's amazing what I pick up when I give presentations, someone informed me that Francis de Sales died on December 28th, 1622. Yeah. So this was very probably one of his last, if not his last, homilies. So here's where he was at the end of his life. And it's a beautiful homily to read the whole thing through. And he starts off by saying, consider the goodness of God. And then he goes on to talk about the incarnation as something that God was getting so excited about doing. Even before he did anything else, or they did anything else, God was putting everything in place for the incarnation. Okay. And then another, I love to name drop, another important person who was influenced by this vision was Thomas Merton. Those of you that like Thomas Merton, that's something for everybody in this talk, Thomas Merton. A great insight in his conjectures of a guilty bystander, where he discovers God's abundance. And in response to something like Francis of Assisi's fifth admonition, this notion of consider the dignity. Consider what does it mean to be human. The immense joy of being a human being. We belong. We're the only group. I mean, I like roses, okay, so I don't want to say anything bad about roses. But as far as I know, God has never chosen to become a rose bush. So we can like and admire other species and other aspects of life. But let's face, stand up straight. I don't mean right now, but I mean, we're it. I mean, God created the world in order to enter into the world, and God chose to enter into the world as somebody like us, like you and me. And not even on our good days, right? There's that Canaanite woman that comes, with the dog under the table thing, even the dogs can eat the scraps. And that's Jesus on a bad day, right? He doesn't always get everything right, but neither do we. So what does Merton say? If only everybody realized this. If only everybody realized this, but it cannot be explained. Isn't that true? You can't convince somebody they are beloved by God. You have to experience it. There's no way of telling people they are all walking around shining like the sun. And I understand that African spirituality, especially Ghanaian spirituality, has this same insight about people shining forth like the sun, that within each of us is the sun waiting to shine out. I was looking at this little plaque over here on the ledge. There's something about may you discover the mystery within, and may the dignity within be the dignity without. I mean, just even in our own lives, do we bring our external behaviors and actions and attitudes in line with the enormous mystery that is the light within us. I mean, this is a land. We can spend the rest of eternity working on this land. So, what difference does all this make? Well, I think you're already beginning to make the connections. Is this an invitation to look again? And if we're going to look again, what? What are we going to look again at? Okay. Well, the traditional teaching, now this is the one I grew up on, it's probably the one you grew up on. Right? The traditional teaching derived from the Benedictine Anselm of Canterbury, 11th century thinker, great saint, great doctor of the church, who wrote in a treatise called Cur Deus Homo, which means why did God become human? And he explained why God became human. And it's the one I learned when I was growing up and going to school, the Baltimore Catechism. The incarnation was God's response to sin. Right? Adam and Eve fell, okay. Terrible crime against God, right? A human person cannot make up for the terrible injury that has been done to God. It's an infinite sin. It's an infinite fault. Therefore, somebody's got to come who is capable of paying the debt. Right? So sound familiar? Right. Okay, so who did that for us? Jesus did that for us. What a guy. Right? What a great guy. He came to take on our sins. And there's a lot of this in Paul. Right? Paul has the great Ephesians and Colossians hymns. He's also got the letter to the Romans, which is nice. But there are other parts of Paul that really feed into this notion of you're paying a debt, you're paying a debt, you got to pay back. It's all about paying back. And Christ's passion and death set in balance the scales of justice once again. Thanks be to God, he went through it. We don't have to. He opened the gates of heaven for all of us. We don't have to make up for our own sins because God makes up for our own sins. Right? Now, the payoff about this vision, and many of our Protestant brothers and sisters really can get into this, is that if there were no sin, there would be no incarnation. So you got to be real careful about talking about the incarnation independently of sin, because there is no reason for God to become human if we hadn't sinned. And I don't know about you, but if I were God, I wouldn't have done it. I mean, I only would have done it for a really good reason. And this looks like a really good reason. They need it. They need me. Right? I'm God. They need me. Right? Just a little remote prep for the Easter Vigil, right? We all wait for it every year when they sing the Exultet. If you're familiar with the Exultet, which is sung at it's a very old Christian prayer. Oh, happy fault. Oh, necessary evil. If it hadn't been for Adam and Eve, way to go, right? Adam and Eve, if they hadn't fallen, we never would have gotten Jesus. So let's hear it for our two first parents. I don't mean that really. For our two first parents. I know you're with me, right? Let's hear it for our two first parents who failed miserably, right? But boy, do we like them, right? Now, we know it's a story, so we're going to put that part aside. But the theoretical point of it is the incarnation, according to this theory, or this vision, is predicated upon what's wrong with us. Right? It's predicated upon what's wrong with us, not about what's right with us. So I guess admonition 5A for this would be, consider your sinfulness, you creeps. Right? I mean, if Francis had really bought into this, he would have said, now just go into the corner, right, and take 5, and turn your face to the wall, and I want you to think about all of the reasons God has for not loving you. And I say, as somebody who teaches young people in college, and any of you who are involved in education, know That's not the message for young people today. And I can tell you, that's not a God that's attractive to them at all. It's a vindictive God. It's a hateful God. It's a spiteful God. It's everything we say God is not. But we have a way of delivering a covert message, right? The overt message is God loves you, but the covert message is, and you don't deserve it. And so as we know, any of us in education know, a self-fulfilling prophecy will always come true. If you tell a student they can't do it, they can't do it. If you tell them they can do it, they can. So, what does the Franciscan perspective offer in response? Well, it offers SCOTUS, right? That's why I'm here today. Anselm says, the incarnation is God's response to sin. SCOTUS says, no, the incarnation is God's design. It was the plan behind the plan, right? It was plan A, one plan B. He didn't have to come in and do something quick at the end to save everything. Anselm says, the incarnation was a divine reaction to sin. SCOTUS says, no. The incarnation was God's initiative, and God is always ahead of us. I mean, it shifts the way we think about how God reacts. God doesn't react. We're the ones that are reactionary. God's an initiative taker. So God is already, it's like a great chess player, right? God is already 5 moves ahead of us, and it doesn't matter which moves we make. God's already got the game, better than the best computer we can think about. Anselm's vision will say, you get rid of sin at your peril, because if you get rid of sin, you get rid of Jesus, or you get rid of Christ, you get rid of the incarnation. SCOTUS says, nope, you've got him anyway. Now, sin is a reality, and we'll talk about this before the end of today. Sin is a reality for SCOTUS, so it's not about pretending sin doesn't exist, and it's not about pretending that we're perfect. What it's about is shifting the way we look at the world. And like any good shift, like a gestalt, you've seen those pictures where you've got the 2 faces, and then the dark in the middle, and then you shift, and suddenly the dark in the middle is a vase, and the 2 faces become the background. So what's in the background moves to the foreground, what's in the foreground moves to the background. That's what we're talking about. So we're not talking about get rid of sin altogether. We're simply saying, no, sin is a background in this whole thing. It's not the foreground. And this, I think, is key to our experience of abundance and generosity and seeing the world anew. I have to give a plug for the real title. Right? Okay. Anselm says it's Felix culpa, happy fault. SCOTUS says with Francis, no one rejoices in the sin of another. It is not just uncharitable, it is unchristian to rejoice that someone else made a mistake. And the kind of mistake that resulted in the sorts of things that were lost when Adam and Eve had to be expelled from the Garden of Paradise. I mean, we wouldn't want that on, you wouldn't wish that on your worst enemy. Why are we getting excited about this? It's a conversion. This involves a conversion in our seeing the world. So we come back to our different elements, and what happens? Well, in Anselm's vision, which I just want to say in parentheses, Anselm's vision is a gracious vision. It shows a compassionate God who cares about us. It's, the Samaritan on the road who sees the beat-up person and stops to help. So I don't want to make Anselm out to be the heavy in all of this, but I think we can realize that if you've got a perspective focused on sin, it can, in spite of the best intentions, which we all know where they lead, in spite of the best intentions, result in a spiritual vision that is really very negative, very elitist, very negative, very focused on behaviors rather than attitudes. I mean, it calls forth sometimes the worst in sincere religious people. So, what does the theology become? Well, God is the judge. And that's, it's all about justice, it's paying back, it's the debt, all that. Who are we as human beings? We're sinners, right? There has to be a reason for the problem, and we're the problem, right? We're certainly not the solution. Jesus is the solution. Jesus Christ, and of course the whole purpose of the incarnation, was to have not just a victim, but an innocent and sinless victim. And that's a very important part of this spiritual vision, is that innocent people suffer. And they suffer precisely because there's a debt that has to be paid. Now we're going to come back to this a little bit later on. But it feeds in a whole way of understanding, a kind of victimization spirituality, where I'll stop there. I can get carried away, and I don't want to minimize suffering. But sometimes people can exult in their suffering. It makes them better than other people. Easy for me, I haven't suffered greatly. But anyway, salvation is repaying a debt, right? It's like a big ledger, for those of you that are into economics and budget keeping. It's the bottom line, right? It's all about the bottom line. Got to pay the debt, repay the debt. It's God as vending machine kind of spirituality, right? I don't deserve this, right? I pray, I pay my debts, I pay my dues. I shouldn't have these bad things happen to me. So there's that kind of spiritual economics with God. The eschaton is Matthew 25, and of course we all know Matthew 25 because we hear it regularly, and we should hear it regularly. Right? That the people on the left and the people on the right, the people that get to go into heaven are the ones that clothed the naked, they fed the hungry, they gave drink to the thirsty, they welcomed the stranger, they visited the prisoner, and the spiritual and corporal works of mercy that come from that. But the bad guys on the left, right, they're the ones who didn't serve these people. So even within this lens, there are some people that are going to make it to heaven, and there are other people who are not. And it's going to be by their own behaviors, right? And there are some traditions that really play this out, right? The Seventh-day Adventists, that 144,000 thing. I mean, you can get more relief, right? You can get it down to numbers, you can get it down to people I like. You can get down, we're sure we know who's going to hell. The ecclesiology, right? Who belongs to the church? Well, the few, right? The ones who've been saved, the ones who've accepted Jesus as their Lord and Savior. There's the whole way in which we can play this out. And missiology is my favorite one. What inspires us to go out to the world? We got to save them, As He has done for us, we will do for them, right? We'll go out there, and the 19th century, the 18th and 19th centuries, neocolonialism or colonialism, this had the t-shirt on this one. We go into those countries, we turn them into us, we will raise them and train them to be like us, and then we don't understand why they don't like us. Because we have to save them from themselves, because they have no idea how sinful they are. They don't even know. My gosh, they don't even know they're sinful. We have to tell them. So the first notion of conscientiousization, especially I think in our missionary efforts, not ours obviously personally, but our forebears, in the missionary efforts, was to impress upon people how sinful they were. Rather than to impress upon them their dignity, how beautiful they were. And so many people in third world countries have these divided consciousness, right? They're ashamed of their color because they don't look like the people that they're supposed to look like, and that's not even to mention all the pictures of Jesus we had around the world that looked like us and not like them. Anyway, you can carry on with this because we can understand, and it's consistent. And I think that's the point I'm trying to make. This is a consistent lens, and one thing follows the next, and it's attitudes toward, but it's based on sin. Sin becomes not just the elephant in the room, but the only thing we think about, the only thing we talk about, the only thing we strategize. According to this vision, it's the Franciscan vision, it's also Scotus, what Scotus does. God is love. That's God's first name, love. That's God's middle name, that's God's last name, right? Love, love, and love. Right? Love. Who are we? Well, we're the beloved, right? We're the ones that are loved. And no, we don't deserve it, so get over it and move on, right? No, we don't have to think about, now this makes us great. It doesn't make us great. It makes us fabulously loved. I mean, for any of us, and I'm sure we've all fallen in love at least once, to fall in love is to realize the world turns upside down and nobody's changed a thing, but all of a sudden, we're turned inside out. And the deepest recognition is that we don't deserve it. And so we have this enormous sense of gratitude that somebody has loved us. Who is Jesus in this? Not so much the sinless victim, God with us. Emmanuel. That's the plan. To be with us. So notice, these all have biblical sources. So the Franciscan vision and the Scotus vision is not, throw away your Bibles, ladies and gentlemen, we're now going to talk about how good we are. No. There are strong and significant scriptural bases for this theology. And it's always been in the tradition. It's just always been, as it were, under the radar. Under the radar. Salvation is not about repaying a debt. It's about reconciliation. It's about peacemaking. It's about embracing the friend. Notice I didn't say embracing the enemy, because when you embrace them, they're no longer your enemy. It's transforming the enemy into the friend. That's what salvation is. That is salvific. That is how we make whole and make healthy and make holy. The eschaton, rather than Matthew 25, is Matthew 20. And I know some of you know this, but what parable is that? I'll have to, because it's about ready to stop for a break. The workers in the field, the 11th hour. Remember the guys that show up at 6 a.m. and work all day? Yeah, and then those creeps come at 4:45 and they get the same amount, right? What a jip, right? So we can identify with the people who've been working all day long. But in some ways, they're the Pharisees, right? They're the ones they're the religiously righteous. They're the holy people. They're the ones that have kept the law, that have gone to temple, that have done their prayers, that think they have a relationship with God. But what does the parable show? They don't. They think they have a relationship with God, but they don't see the way God sees. And that great line of the owner, are you jealous because I'm generous? Are you jealous because I'm generous? So in some ways, this vision, it invites those of us who have turned away from sin and try to turn away from sin. But our turning is not over. It's not just about turning away from sin, it's also about seeing the world differently. And ecclesiology is everybody, and our purpose in life is to imitate God's love. So the last one about the ecclesiology, the church is everyone, right? Everyone ultimately called. And the missiology, the attitude we should have in our work, in our apostolate, in our reach out to the world is that of the incarnation. In other words, we will do what Jesus did. And if Jesus came to be present, then guess what? That's what we're called to do. We are called to be present where we are. And not necessarily come in with the great message, the great insight, the great reforming and valiant proposal, but rather to just be with people and be present to them where they are. Which again, these are things that are easy to say, so hard to do. It's much easier to save the world than it is to be present to it. I think, at least for myself. It's much easier for me to come into a situation, tell everybody what to do, than to come in and be attentive to what's going on in the situation and to try to work out or to be that presence, that loving presence of God in the midst of that situation. So it's a real call for all of us. And I like to extrapolate a little bit on the Matthew 20. This is a joke that I like to tell, or a funny anecdote. So if you think about Matthew 20, that you are going to have the sense you've worked harder and longer, and now that I know there are some Sisters of St. Joseph in the room, I can really tell the joke that I normally tell about, at least for my community, right, CSJs, we would have been the Matthew 20 parable. We'd been there at 6:45 in the morning. We'd be working all day long. We'd take a shorter lunch. We'd do yard duty, then we'd come back in. Then we'd be working hard. And at about 4:45, you know, the Franciscans would just kind of be moseying down the road. And, you know, we'd say, where have you been? And they said, well, we ran into a couple of people we knew. But as I like to say to people when I think about Matthew 20, as I like to say to groups, my advice is prepare yourself now for the people you will run into in heaven. Because I think there are going to be some people who will surprise us. And I'm positive that a couple of people are going to be floored to watch you walk through the pearly gates. So there's going to be surprises for everyone. And another nice way of thinking about Lent is to think about it as a time when I prepare myself for all of the reconciliation that I will need within me as you never know who you're going to be sitting next to at the banquet. Those place cards are going to be there, and you just might find out that the one person you were sure would never make it to heaven is the person next to you, and you've got to make that small talk that you make at dinner. Hi, how are your family? Anything good happened to you lately? So it is a stark contrast. I think when we see it laid out in this way, we can really appreciate what a shift it is in what we look at and what we pay attention to. And somebody came up to me at the break, and this often happens to me when we look at these things. Somebody came up to me at the break and said, you know, I've always thought this. I've always had this my little hidden spiritual vision has been this one over here, the one where God is love. And I've tried to A, keep my mouth shut, and B, kind of stick with the program when it comes to talking about it, because I thought the party line was over here. And in order to be considered orthodox, you had to kind of speak the doctrine. And more often than not, I've had people come up to me and say, this is the spiritual vision that has given life to my life, has given life to my relationship with God, has given life to my ministry. And I think what is so refreshing, exciting, enlivening for me as I look at this is to recognize that there is a deep, deep tradition within our Catholic tradition that is this vision. And it's not just the Franciscan tradition. There are early church writers, the church fathers, a lot of the Eastern fathers of the church, who wrote in this kind of vision. It was a divinization vision of the incarnation. It was not a sin-based vision of the incarnation. So it is in our history. But you know, I feel like those commercials on TV where they say, you know, you get the watch, but that's not all, right? Or you'll send in your 1995 and you'll get the chopper and the slicer and the dicer, and you go through all that, okay, and then they say, but that's not all, right? So Scotus, like the great marketer that he is, he says, you know what? You liked it so far? It's not all. There's another boffo piece of information that you're going to be really excited to hear, and that is this. And here's a little quote from Scotus, so you say you know the guy. It is well said, he says, that God always rewards beyond our worth. Hot dog, right? And universally beyond any particular value which an act might merit. So guess what? We don't deserve it. Okay, fine. Move on. Right? It's not about deserving it. It's not about deserving it because nobody deserves it. Not even the best of us deserve it. This merit, this reward, is beyond nature and its intrinsic goodness. So their nature has intrinsic goodness. We have intrinsic goodness. And what we're going to get in response for the lives that we try to live, we're trying to do well, it's going to be more because God loves to do this. I mean, love is generous. And this is the way God's going to behave, generously. So what does he call it? A gratuitous divine acceptance. Right? So like those old Argus posters, right? It's not the case that God just doesn't make junk, because God doesn't make junk, right? So there's nothing overwhelmingly gratuitous about this because God has made us. And to think back, Francis of Assisi's Admonition 5, right? We're considering the dignity. This is all a meditation on the dignity with which we've been created. So much dignity that we even get more reward than anything that dignity deserves. I mean, that's phenomenal. Right? To say, you thought the abundance was just enough. No, it's more. It's even more than the second, we had the first, the Anselmian vision, we had the Scotus vision. Well, guess what? There's more than that. And I suppose we could just put love in every single one of the categories, right? Who's God? Love. Who are we? Love. What is salvation? Love. Who's the church? Love. Who's going to be there at the end? Love. And so the answer is everything. Everything and everybody. And so now we'll come back to, as I promised, do all dogs go to heaven? This is a great contrast for you. You'll remember this. You'll forget everything else, but you'll remember this. That's a great story. This is a nice way to remember the difference between Scotus and Thomas Aquinas, whom I like very much, by the way. But here's a nice way. Thomas Aquinas says that heaven involves understanding and loving God. Now, since we're the only beings that can understand God, animals and, lower forms of life, they're not going to go to heaven. Because the requirements of heaven are that you are able to understand and love God. So we qualify because we can understand and love God. So according to Aquinas, rational beings go to heaven, but irrational or non-rational beings, they'll have a nice kind of a sub-heaven, but basically it won't be our heaven. Now, Scotus says this. What is heaven? What do we mean by heaven? Heaven is the complete experience of God of which a being is capable. I'll say that again. Heaven is the complete and full experience of God of which a being is capable. According to that definition, animals won't go to heaven because they're already in heaven. Because animals and nature already experience God to the fullest extent of their natural capacity. We're the ones that are not quite clear on the concept. We're the ones that need help. Now that, I think, it's a phenomenally different way of understanding what does it mean to be in heaven. I mean, this, for a number of people, this explains why animals have the kind of attention to and sensitivity about us and what we're going through. The power of animals to be present and consoling, especially to people at the end of their lives. I mean, this is something there. And the elderly, they're just discovering, and something animals probably knew all along, they're just discovering the power of and it's pure presence, right? Dogs especially, they're just pure loving presence. So you don't have to worry about animals you love. Scotus says, we will join them there. We will join them there. We don't have to wait for them to come to us. we'll join them there. It's a beautiful way of thinking about heaven and about animals with whom we share this earth. Father Alan Walter said to me once, he said, yeah, I think Scotus had a dog. That kind of explains it, right? Okay, next one. Okay, so now what does this all mean? We're getting ready to break into some little groups. What does this all mean, right? So what happens now? This is the so what question. So what does it all mean? Well, it means basically, here's the short version of the whole talk, we can shift the focus from our fallenness and not lose the incarnation. I mean, that's the payoff as far as I'm concerned. And the secondary payoff is that God's love is not measured by our brokenness, by our fallenness. God's love is measured by God. It belongs to God to be generous because love is generous. And that's all God asks us to do is imitate that generosity. Okay. So what difference does it make? Well, as I said at the beginning, I think it's a difference that makes all the difference. It's a tiny, teeny-weeny difference, but it makes a very big difference. We have an optimistic vision of the human person. Now, you know, in the Franciscan tradition, you have an optimistic vision of the human person. I mean, just radically, Franciscans, I think, you're just radically in love with people. That's why you get there late. We're working all day long. Ran into people you knew, had to talk to them, couldn't get away without a cup of coffee. But, you know, enormous love for the world. Enormous love for the world. An abundant vision of divine action. God's out in front. We don't have to worry about God catching up with us. We're the ones that need to worry about catching up with God. An affirmation of divine presence. And that's really what it's about. It's about being present to what's going on. And as we know, it's not just being physically in a place, right? Because we've all been in places where we were physically there, but not there. Right? And any of you are teachers who know it's not enough to get the kids in the room. They can be in the room and out of the room at the same time. So to think of presence in a psychological way, mindfulness, attentive to, watching every sign. Because as we know, some of the most remarkable and revelatory indicators happen in detail. Small things that if I'm distracted by the next thing I have to do, or I got to get out of here and go see somebody else, I will miss what somebody communicates to me, probably not verbally, what they communicate to me about where they are right now and what their needs are. I can completely miss it. You know, I didn't see anything. Well, no, you didn't. But were you looking? And finally, a vision inspired by hope and joy, right? It's giving words and giving witness to the hope that's within us. At a time in our global, economic, national, civic, political history when we need to call upon the Spirit to fill us with the grace to really give witness to the hope that's within us. And not, I'm watching the news every day, I'm sure you are too. I tend to watch NBC, this is not an advertisement. But Brian Williams was saying a couple of weeks ago, you know, people have been writing to us and they've been saying, would you stop reporting such negative news? I mean, people are committing suicide over the kind of stuff that you people are talking about as the chattering class, right? You have nothing else to talk about, so let's talk about whether or not the economy is going to recover. As we know, ordinary working people young people don't need that. They don't need it. What we need are people who are offering examples of hope and abundance. And so now NBC Nightly News every night, they are showing these stories, fabulous stories of human generosity. And you and I both know, or we all know, these things go on all the time. It's not the economic crisis that has brought them to happen, but I think in many ways, in the economic crisis, we're starting to look for them. People that are just living lives of generosity pouring forth around us. Many times people who are not of our faith tradition, who are in fact evangelizing us to the kind of men and women we should be in the world. I mean, what was it, the great and pessimistic philosopher of the 19th century, Friedrich Nietzsche, said, what's so attractive about Christianity? None of them look very happy. You know, we're supposed to be the good news, right? If this is the good news, I don't want to hear the bad news, right? So it's a call, this is a real call for us to be prophetic and to be in some ways countercultural to the concerns and the negativity and the downward thinking and the scarcity thinking that can go on. There's not going to be enough for all. We're all going to lose everything we have. But we have to be creative. We have to think outside the box. I hate that expression, but I'll use it. We have to think, be daring, be innovative. Think about different ways of coming at situations. And realizing that we have, and I say this to myself, especially when I'm stressed. I walk around and I say, I have everything I need to do what I am called to do. I have everything I need. I don't need more. I've got everything I need. And if we have that attitude, we would probably end up doing with less, and we would be more joyful and be happier. But wait. All this is fine, right? But aren't we just getting a little too carried away with how happy we are, how hopeful we are? As I mentioned earlier in response to a question, one of the benefits of Anselm's vision is that it really takes seriously and squarely addresses the question of suffering, and not just any old suffering, but the suffering of the innocent. How do we understand when a child is diagnosed with leukemia, or there's a tragic death of a youngster who's trying to get out of a gang-infested neighborhood, but he gets caught in the crossfire? I mean, these are sometimes what we might call meaningless moments of suffering, or situations where a young family, where the mother is diagnosed with cancer too late and dies. How do we deal with that? In the Anselmian vision, of course, there is a way of dealing with it, and it has to do with this notion of suffering for another, right? Yes, I know you didn't deserve what happened to you, but you can join your suffering to the suffering of Jesus, and thereby make up for, and even Paul has this, right, to make up for what is lacking in the sacrifice of Jesus. So there is a kind of a calculation that can go on where we can offer it up, right? I remember that when I was a child, for the poor souls in purgatory, right, or any other poor souls that happen to be hanging out wherever they're hanging out. That as Jesus was the innocent victim who suffered to redeem us, we can be innocent victims who suffer to redeem others. So there is a way in which Anselm's model handles that. And I think in a lot of ways it handles it in a reasonable way. It might not be the best way, but it is a reasonable way that you can make some sense of it. But Scotus's vision really doesn't seem to make sense of it. It just leaves it out, as it were. I mean, in some ways, the problem is less about explaining how a loving God would send his son to suffer as to how a loving God will allow me to suffer. This person, this loving God apparently loves as much as God does. What is the meaning of suffering? And I think there the book of Job is the wonderful biblical backdrop text of why do bad things happen to good people. And as I heard a rabbi lecture on the book of Job once, and he said, in the book of Job, we have every single human response to the unexplained suffering of an individual, if you look at the different characters in the book of Job. And if you know the book of Job well, you know that there is no final explanation as to why. Job never gets the answer to his question. God simply says, were you there when I put the world together? Are you the one that calls forth the dawn? Are you the one that makes sure the stars are doing what they're doing? And the answer back to Job is more an answer of, you can never understand all of this and the meaning of all of this. And I think that is also part of our tradition, what we call the mysterium iniquitatis, the mystery of iniquity, the mystery of evil and sin and suffering that lies at the heart of all human life. So there is a part of it that will always lie beyond our ability to understand. In fact, this rabbi said the key to the book of Job is not the questions that Job asks or his friends weigh in on, nor any answers, because there are no answers. The key to the book of Job is that God shows up. That's the key to the book of Job. Not that God gives the answer, but that God is present. And God takes the question seriously. And that from the Jewish perspective, what's so good about Job is he's able to stand in God's presence and try to give God a little lecture, right? Because this is the prototypical Jewish attitude of covenant. That this is what it means when they say Moses can speak to God face to face as a friend speaks to another friend. You know, Job is at work and look God in the eye and say, do you have any idea what you're doing? And that is, in a lot of ways, the ideal Jewish relationship with God. And I think in some ways it's a healthy human relationship with another person with whom one is in relationship. Right? To be able to look God in the eye and say, what the heck are you thinking of? I mean, in some ways it makes us feel better. And but we, like Job, need to be ready for the fact that there may not be the answer that makes sense to us in terms of an economy of salvation. You know, 35,000 innocent victims have to suffer so that everybody gets out of hell in the end. You know, we can put together the calculation if we want to, but we don't know that that's anything other than just our own attempt at making sense of it. So what does the Franciscan tradition do with this question of suffering, and what would somebody like Scotus say to the question of suffering? Well, there are really two different questions we can ask about this, and I'm going to suggest that I think the Franciscan answer is the second one and not the Franciscan question is the second question and not the first question. The first question is the question I have just laid out and the one that we tend to talk about. Why do innocent people suffer? Why does anyone suffer, and why is there evil in the world, right? If God is so good, why is there evil in the world? Now, I think there are many traditions that engage with this question, and they engage it fairly directly and fairly clearly. Certainly, I would say the Ignatian tradition takes it seriously and engages with it seriously. Perhaps the Dominican tradition takes it seriously and engages with it seriously. The Benedictine tradition may take it seriously and engage with it seriously. But to my mind, and of course you're the representative, so I'm just the outsider, to my mind, it seems to me the question from your traditional spiritual approach does not have to do with explaining the phenomenon of suffering. It has to do with relieving the suffering. So and again, this is the presence, right? If we are present to what's going on, then it's less about explaining or helping someone else put words around whatever theory might help them get through their suffering. And I'm not against theory. I think each person deserves to be able to say why they think they're suffering. But for me, as an onlooker or someone who's participating in the life of another person who is suffering, it seems to me the Franciscan question is the question of response. What am I going to do in the presence of this suffering? Now, you know, we have to watch that question, what am I going to do? Because sometimes what I am called to do is ask the person if they want me to do anything. And if they say no, then that's what I have to do. But to be present to their suffering, and if I can see what can be done, you know, if this is a hungry person, I certainly don't want to say, what do you want me to do? Feed me. You know, are you, you know, how, you know, it doesn't take rockets. Sometimes the concerns are those that you don't have to be a rocket scientist to work out what needs to be done. Getting somebody help, you know, if somebody's lying on the floor bleeding, you do not ask their permission to call 911. You call 911. you take care of the person who is suffering. But some instances of suffering are such that if somebody were to come in and try to fix it, or make it better, or explain it, or do something too active or overly active, it would not be appropriate to that situation, because this is, you're in the presence of somebody who is suffering, and maybe all they want you to do is be present to them. And I have not had the kind of experience I'm sure many of you have had in hospice care or dealing with people who are terminally ill. From my limited experiences, all I know is the hardest thing in the room, or the hardest thing to do, is to stay in the room and be present to somebody who is suffering and not do anything. It's so much, easier flitting around, can I bring in water, can I bring in... We have that desire to be effective, to be able to say, well, they were suffering and I relieved their suffering, or they were suffering and I was able to do something, when in fact it's to stand with the person, to just stand there. One of our sisters works in detention. I'm sure a number of you know people, or you yourselves work in detention ministry, and sometimes in detention ministry, all you can do is go with the young person when they go to court and just be in the audience. Not do anything, not stand up for them as their parent, not do anything other than simply be present. Be with them, they know you're there, be present to them through, writing letters and all of that, the way where we can be present to people who are in prison. So the second question is, it's the existential question, it's the active question, it's, Franciscans might say, it's the praxis question. What do I do? What is my attitude meant to be? What are my actions meant to convey? It's, I think, like everything else we've seen, it's the harder question. Because the theoretical, I can get drawn into a kind of a theoretical reflection, which may in fact distance me from the actual suffering in the room. And I don't know about you, I've had situations in my life that have been disappointing. I wouldn't call them tragic, but disappointing. And I've actually had other people try to weigh in, like the friends of Job. Let me explain to you why this has happened, right? Let me explain to you what you could have done differently to have avoided this situation. And, they mean well, and I think we need to acknowledge that they mean well, but I didn't find it helpful. And in fact, I found them responding to their problem with what I was going through and not asking me to talk about my experience of what I was going through. So it's a nuance that I think is important to bring forward, that there is, in Scotus's approach, or this Franciscan approach, there is a way in which it appears to leave suffering off the radar as something we don't need to deal with, or evil off the radar as something we don't need to deal with. I think it's very much on the radar for the tradition, but I think the question that is asked is not the theoretical question about the meaning of, the nature of, the why would a loving God allow this to happen. I mean, those are questions for perhaps others, and for the person who's suffering themselves. But our question as someone walking with someone who's suffering can be the more praxis approach. So. Here are now a set of questions. So you get to choose what questions you think about and talk about. But it is very much in terms of what you have said, and more or less the questions are the same. But it's all about divine love from the very beginning. So how do I see myself? How can I get trapped, as you say, in old ways of thinking, in different negative ways of thinking? And what are the moments of divine presence in my life? So that's the first set of questions. A season of active loving. How do I see myself as my life as one of presence? How do I see events as divine epiphanies? And then the third slide. A season of transformation. How do I already work? I hope you're at least able to think, oh, I do that already. What do I already do? What's working? How could I deepen this ability? And how do I see my life as one pouring out divine love to a broken world?